Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Chloe. I'm a recent graduate of UCLA with a bachelor's degree in art history and Egyptology and a joint master's degree in Egyptology with an emphasis in Egyptian art and architecture. So today I'm making a highly requested video on what it's like studying art history as an undergraduate. So I will mostly be speaking about my experience studying specifically at UCLA, but a lot of this information is transferable to other universities, but just keep that in mind. And the number one question I got was about careers. So I'm actually going to save that for a part 2 to this video about what it's like to try and find a job as an art history major, what you can do, etc., etc. So if you want to see that, please give this video a like and subscribe and comment down below. And without further ado, let's get into the video. So I went onto my Instagram stories and I asked you all what assumptions or questions you had about studying art history. And the number one assumption about art history is that we just look at pictures, name artists, name dates, name artistic styles and movements, analyze the works for what's going on, and that's it. Which, if you sit in an art history class, I can see how sometimes that seems like what's happening. But you can't look at a Leonardo da Vinci painting and not understand that there was a lot of colonization going on and exploration of the New World and interest in scientific studies and how that influenced his artwork. So we never study a work of art in isolation. So really, art history is philosophy, political studies, religious studies, history generally, and language as well. It's all combined to see how all of those influences are then represented in this piece of artwork. So for example, I study ancient Egyptian art, which the ancient Egyptians didn't even have a word for art, but that's a different story. But I look at how the politics of the time, the history of the time, what wars or conflicts were going on in regions and how that manifests in the artistic style, because that is our main point of study. So really, art history is just every other humanities with pictures. That's the short of it. And that also leads to the next question of what kind of art history can you study? So art history is a huge field and it also branches into a lot of subcategories. So for instance, if you're studying ancient art history, usually you are also taking anthropology, archaeology courses, and you can't separate the material culture from the rest of the culture. So, and that includes the arts of Africa and even contemporary art, because artists are so often responding to political moments or the broader culture at hand and critiquing it or giving their interpretation or how it's affected them. You cannot study it in isolation. So really, you can study everything. So from Neolithic to contemporary and everything in between. Yes, there are famous art movements that we study in beginning courses in your your lower division courses, but usually you can branch out in whatever direction. As long as there's a professor at your university, you can pretty much study anything. So another assumption is that you have to make art as an art history major. And depending on your university, they may require an art making class just so you have an understanding of the materials, but this isn't always the case. UCLA did not require you to have a studio art course, though I do have some background in art making, so I'm familiar with the mediums, but it's not required at all schools, though it can be helpful, which I will say knowing how to be familiar with materials is very different from knowing how to use them properly. It does give you a lot of respect for artists who work with clay, for example, I can't make anything, but I can really understand the time and the effort that goes into making the works that they then produce. So it gives you an appreciation, it gives you an understanding of process and how they may have made it and why that is significant. But it's not required. You do not have to make art to be an art historian. So the next question is, what kind of classes do you take as an art history student? So usually you have 3 types of courses. You have your lectures, which are between 30 to 200 plus people. At UCLA, I think we had one that had 300 people. And that is a course where your professor is up in front of the classroom, has a PowerPoint, presenting to the class, and there's very little discussion going on between students and professor. Usually the professor either goes chronologically or has a thematic idea for the class, and that's how they structure it. Seminars are your next type of course, which are much smaller, usually have a max of 15 students. And that is a course where you usually have to come way more prepared than a lecture. You are sitting with a small group of students and the professor, and it's much more discussion based. So you have to come in having read your readings, have questions prepared, and topics that you want to discuss when you come into the classroom. And then those courses are usually an hour and a half to up to 3 hours long, and you just have a discussion, and sometimes you may lead discussion, have a presentation. That's how my seminars were usually structured, but it does fluctuate from course to course. But the key is they are discussion based. And then your third course is a research option. So you can either do independent research where you are developing your own personal research under the guidance of a faculty advisor that you seek out, reach out to, say, hi, this is the research idea I have, I'd like to work with you. Or you can also help professors with their own research. This depends on professor to professor, of course, and university to university, but a lot of times professors are developing their own research and they could use some help in a research assistant, and students can definitely step in and do that. Another question I got about classes is an assumption that a lot of the courses you take are focused on European art. So traditionally, this was the case, that most of your beginner courses were a survey of art history starting from Neolithic up to contemporary, and very much focused on the European American world. And then you had your electives that you could choose to take that were non-Western art classes. So now in the US, this is very much starting to be phased out. So for example, at UCLA, I know they were one of the first universities to phase this out, where instead of having a broad survey course where you're studying, 1,000 plus years in like 4 weeks, you now have classes like one class on the Renaissance, one class on the arts of Africa, and you have to take a certain number of courses in a certain geographic region, a certain time period. So for example, at UCLA, you had to take one course in ancient art, one course in the pre-modern era to early modern era, and then one course in the modern era. And then you also had to fulfill geographic regions. So one European, one North African, or Middle East, and it breaks down even further, Asia. And so really there are universities now that are pushing to have a more diverse art history. So I took courses like Caribbean art and art and architecture and urbanism in Africa, and that way you get a very diverse art history, and it's not so centered around the Western world. Yale just recently also changed their survey courses, so this is definitely something that's slowly starting to happen in the US, so that we are not so focused on European masters. The way it used to be is you would have a textbook that this much of the textbook was about the Renaissance, which was only 100 years, and then all of the arts of Asia was like maybe 35 pages. So it's something that art historians are really trying to push and get outside of the Western world. Colonization and the colonial history of art history is definitely a topic that I'm very invested in as a white person who studies Egyptian art. It's very much prevalent in my field and something I am cognizant of as I'm talking about this subject. So that's the kind of classes you take. Another question I got about classes is, what do you actually have to do for an art history course? What are your assignments like, and what kind of sources do you have to look at for research? So this very much depends on the course and the professor, but usually the structure of my course was one midterm, one final, and a final paper. Or it was a couple short quizzes or reading responses. Maybe it was an in-person midterm and a take-home final that was about a 5 to 10 page paper. It varied from class to class. I averaged having to do a 10-page paper per course once a term. Usually those were research papers. Art history, you have to do a lot of reading. That was a big assumption I got, and yes, it's true. Art history is a very heavy reading course. But it also has lots of pictures, but very dense content. So, you know, you win some, you lose some. What kind of sources you look at? Your primary source are the art objects that you are looking at, but depending on the time period, it also can be letters from an artist or historical documents that ground the work in a certain moment. So it really depends on the time and place. So for me, studying ancient Egyptian art, my thesis was surrounding a temple. So the temple itself was the primary source, but so were some papyri that were documents from that time. So giving me context to what was going on in those scenes. So very broad. Like I said, art history, you're looking at the art, but you're looking at everything else in between. It can be looking at religious texts. It also includes a lot of language. I had to learn French for art history and a bit of German for the Egyptian side specifically, but depending on your region of study, if you choose Japanese art, you may need to learn Japanese, or if you're looking at an area like Mexico or contemporary Mexican art, for example, you will need to learn Spanish. So Italian is also another common language, but it really depends on your area of study. So one last assumption that I got was that art history is intimidating. And this is something that sadly I hear a lot of. So unfortunately, art history kind of lives in this very academic, upper class, rich person society world. Museums have not always been for everybody. Being able to have a higher education degree in art history, you learn a lot of jargon, and the readings are very dense and academic, and there's a lot of gatekeeping of, oh, you shouldn't like that artist, and oh, but you should like this artist, and a lot of things that are very intimidating to somebody who is on the outside, who wants to come in and learn, but it's really hard to break that down. And I just want to say this as an acknowledgement of that. This is a problem with academia as a whole. I do think in 2021, people are seeing that this is a real issue and starting to create materials to help break that down. But this is a huge issue, and I want to validate those feelings and also know that art historians don't know it all. And you are allowed to appreciate a work of art or dislike a work of art, even if scholars like it. As long as you can defend your opinion and state your reasons why you feel that way, your opinions are totally valid. And I hope that by making this channel, maybe producing resources, help break that down a little bit, because even as somebody who I guess is an insider now, I also feel very outside in certain conversations. And it's an industry that is very much inward looking, and we forget a lot about the people on the outside. So this is just your friendly reminder that you are not alone in feeling that. So on that note, we've reached the end of this video. I really hope you've enjoyed it. Please stay tuned for part 2, where I talk all about trying to have a career as an art history major. Well, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.